The British operation in Sierra Leone is generally regarded as a rare success for Western military intervention. And in the popular narrative, British paratroopers deployed to Freetown over a weekend, and through a mixture of professionalism, organisation and indeed chutzpah, saved the UN from disaster and hastened the end of an exceptionally nasty war. 10 years later, the journalist Alex Renton wrote in The Observer that the intervention worked uniquely well in the history of modern military interventions in Africa. So he scared the rebel forces away from the city, got the UN off its knees, and the government's army was revitalised. Time, the graffiti read Queen Elizabeth the King, and Tony Blair remains more popular here than anywhere else on the planet. Which actually isn't particularly difficult. The reality, like all realities, was more complex than this popular narrative suggests. The British certainly helped to stabilise the situation in May 2000, when there appeared to be a high risk of the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, attack on Freetown. And the continuing British presence after that equally certainly contributed to the end of the war. But there was a wealth of circumstance, which even now is poorly understood, that also contributed to what remains a lasting peace. And such factors include exhaustion after 11 really brutal years of war, international pressure on Charles Taylor's regime in Liberia, which was the RUF's principal sponsor. Greater regulation of the diamond trade, this was hugely important, to limit insurgent funding. Highly significant regional military interventions by Nigeria and Guinea. And finally, and not least, the determination of individual members of the UN Security Council that the UN's largest military mission up to that point just had to succeed. Nevertheless, the British intervention was an extraordinary achievement. Although at its maximum, the UK deployed nearly 4,500 people into theatre, of whom 1,300 were ashore, most of the success was achieved by about 300 to 400 British troops in Sierra Leone at any time. During 2 years of intervention in one of Africa's bloodiest wars, there were just 2 British fatalities, of which only 1 was in action. So let's talk a bit about the background to the war and what prompted British intervention in 2000. Now, Sierra Leone, there on the map in West Africa, is a bit smaller than Scotland, for those of you familiar with that part of the world, a bit larger than Tasmania. And it's made up largely of jungle. About 90% of the country remains jungle. At the outbreak of the war in 91, it had a population of about 5 million people, and nobody knows exactly how many. The people were divided into Creoles, freed slaves returned back to West Africa, generally living on the coast. These tended to be well-educated and Christian. They were different from the various inland tribes, of which the Temni and the Mende were the 2 largest. Although many of the inland tribes subscribed to Islam, the majority of the population, both Christian and Islamic, was deeply steeped in traditional beliefs of the spirit world and magic, and remains so. As with most wars, there was no single, easy-to-define cause. The breakdown of the resource-rich economy in the 1980s, largely caused by government corruption, led to dwindling provision of public services, which caused significant public dissatisfaction, in particular when state-funded education was withdrawn in 1987. The government was exceptionally heavy-handed in its repression of dissent, and this fueled a rising cycle of public violence through the late 1980s, especially around the universities in Freetown. A fast expanding young population, both the cities and the rural areas, saw little future in Sierra Leone, with few, if any, opportunities to escape poverty. Now, what converted a difficult but manageable situation for the Sierra Leone government into a violent civil war was the involvement of Libya's President Muammar Gaddafi. He cultivated civil disorder within Freetown's universities, and then, when the ringleaders were expelled, offered training at Libya's World Revolutionary Center just outside Benghazi, alongside a very wide range of African, Asian, and South American would-be revolutionaries. One of those who took up Gaddafi's offer, and also the oldest from Sierra Leone, was a man called Foday Sanko, who was an ex-signals corporal in the Sierra Leone army. Now, it was in Libya that the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, was created, and Foday Sanko was chosen by Gaddafi to be its leader. Gaddafi went on to support the RUF with weapons and cash for several years. Now, whilst in Libya, Sanko befriended another student at the World Revolutionary Center, the Liberian Charles Taylor, who was creating his own revolutionary movement to seize power in Liberia. Now, Taylor persuaded Sanko that for revolution in Sierra Leone to work, he should first help secure Liberia, Sierra Leone's neighbor to its south, for Taylor to enable a line of communications to be established for the flow of Libyan arms to the RUF. Weapons were flown first from Libya to Burkina Faso, and then to Taylor's group in Liberia, beg your pardon. Taylor's and Sanko's plan was to secure the western borders of Liberia, so an attack could then be launched on the ground into Sierra Leone. It took 18 months of fighting in Liberia before the border zone was secured by the rebels and the RUF was ready to launch its attack into Sierra Leone. So on the 27th of March 1991, the war started with a more or less conventional invasion from Liberia, heavily supported by Charles Taylor's rebel Liberians. The next 9 years of war, leading to the British intervention in May 2000, were highly complex. Twice, the RUF faced near extinction. It mutated from a largely conventional force to an accomplished jungle-based guerrilla army. There were two military coups, one democratic election, which brought democracy back to Sierra Leone for the first time in 2 decades, with the election of President Ahmed Kawa. And there was also a highly successful intervention by a South African-based private military company, Executive Outcomes. There were 2 major and equally successful interventions by the regional power Nigeria, and the growth of 2 additional guerrilla armies. The anti-democratic government, Armed Forces Revolutionary Command, AFRC, which was formed from the regular Sierra Leone army following one of the coups, and the pro-democratic government, the pro-Kaba, President Kaba, Civil Defence Force, or CDF, which was formed as locally recruited self-defence organisations from traditional hunter groups, such as the Kamajaws of the Mendi tribe, and other secret societies from the jungle. All the while, the RUF insurgency was being fuelled with supplies from Liberia in exchange for uncut diamonds mined from Sierra Leone's rich alluvial deposits in the east of the country, which were an early target for the RUF. This 9 years of war was also characterised by multiple attempts to end it. There were a number of peace initiatives named after the regional capitals in which negotiations were held. In each case, the RUF broke the terms of the agreement since there was no means of enforcing it. It was the Lome Agreement in 1999 that set the scene for British intervention. Under pressure from both the US and the UK, neither of whom were willing to invest militarily in Sierra Leone, President Kaba had reluctantly agreed to terms that were surprisingly generous to the RUF. including bringing RUF leaders into government. Fode Sanko, for example, became Minister for Mineral Resources, not an appointment guaranteed to restore Sierra Leone's economy. And under the agreement, the Nigerian-led regional forces, ECOWAS, were to be replaced by a UN force, UNAMSA, United Nations missions in Sierra Leone. All armed parties to the conflict, including the Sierra Leone Army and the Civil Defence Force, were to undergo a DDR plan run by the UN. Unfortunately, UNAMSL had neither the numbers nor the resolve of the Nigerians, and Lomé had no teeth. There was nothing in the agreement that would penalise the RUF if they failed to surrender to the DDR programme or give up their weapons. And although there's some evidence that Fode Sanko, now in his ministerial villa in Freetown with his ministerial limousine, may have been genuine about Lomé, he had lost control of the RUS military wing, who were being commanded out in the jungle by the feared Sam Bokhari, ex-dancer and hairdresser. And it was this military wing that had the most to lose and the least to gain by disarmament. Perversely, the DDR programme started with those who it was most easy to disarm, the forces under government control, the army and the CDF, not the RUF. And this left the RUF, by early 2000, as militarily stronger comparatively than they'd ever been in the war. And although UNAMSA was due to expand, still not received its full complement from troop contributing nations. So Lomé went the same way as the others. The RUF used the ceasefire as an opportunity to rebuild and rearm, while the government unilaterally disarmed and made itself relatively weaker against the rebels. Now, before turning to the British intervention, it's worth pointing out some approximate statistics which give an idea of the scale and impact of this war. Out of a population of 5 million, we estimate about 100,000 were killed. Another 100,000 were maimed. About 2 million were displaced. About half of all females aged between the ages of 9 and 30 were raped. By any measure, it was a particularly brutal and violent conflict. And if you want in questions, we can explore some of the reasons why it was so violent. But let's now turn to the British involvement. Although most public attention is focused on Operation Palliser, the original intervention in May 2000, and Operation Barras, the SAS-led hostage rescue of September the same year, the British actually conducted 4 operations in Sierra Leone. Palliser was the original rapid reaction operation mounted in response to the deteriorating situation in Freetown. It started with the evacuation of British and other non-combatants, but evolved into a stabilisation mission and the complete retraining and reorganisation of Sierra Leone's armed forces so they could eventually defeat the RUF. Basilica stood up as Palliser wound down. It inherited Palliser's training and organisation mission, but without the accompanying operational responsibilities and capabilities. Barras was the rescue operation to rescue a number of British personnel taken hostage by the West Side Boys. And Silkman was the final operation, lasting nearly 2 years, designed to coerce the RUF to surrender to the UN-sponsored DDR program. It included continuing development of Sierra Leone's armed forces alongside the design and leadership of the counterinsurgency operation campaign against the RUF. Now, it's important to understand the relationship between these 4 and the impact of them on the final outcome. Palliser was absolutely essential in May 2000 to turn the tide in the government's favour, but it did no more. It didn't defeat the RUF, and it certainly didn't end the war. Basilica attempted to limit UK exposure in Sierra Leone purely to a training role, The deteriorating situation in Sierra Leone in September and October proved that this was a mistake. Without UK leadership and coordinating machinery, the counterinsurgency operation failed. Barras, of course, was a one-off, and although its success is frequently cited in British circles as having a significant impact on the war, most impartial evidence suggests that its influence was much more limited than most British observers claim. It was only during Silkman that the British strategy matured and a campaign plan designed to end the war. Silkman continued early operations' emphasis on building capable Sierra Leone forces, but crucially also developed a counterinsurgency campaign that won the initiative from the RUF and eventually gained control of the main diamond-producing areas which the RUF needed to fund its war. Now, the original British intervention, Operation Palliser, was triggered by a deteriorating security situation following UNAMSL's attempt to establish or to widen the DD operation into RUF-run territory. And at this stage, the RUF ruled the entire eastern half of the country, including most of the diamond-producing areas. Now, UNAMSL was nothing like strong enough to confront the RUF, and it depended entirely on RUF cooperation for DDR to work. That cooperation was not working, it was not forthcoming. Instead, many of the forces sent to establish the DDR centres were either taken hostage or ended up under effective siege. One attempt to break one of the sieges, a Kenyan army company at Makeni, ended up with an entire Zambian battalion being captured by the RUF. In New York, the UN was at a loss as to what to do. The Security Council met on the evening of Thursday the 4th of May, dates are important, the evening of Thursday the 4th of May, and released a statement expressing outrage at the killing of peacekeepers. There was nothing more they could do. So immediately after that meeting, the US and French ambassadors, together with the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, met the British ambassador and impressed upon him Britain's responsibilities to Sierra Leone as the ex-colonial power. The UN had done all it could. It was now up to Britain to rescue the situation. Back in London, the government, the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence were all focused on the Balkan problem, where the UK had recently deployed a corps headquarters and a division into Kosovo, as well as sustaining a brigade in Bosnia. There was very little extra to deal with a crisis somewhere in West Africa, which few Britons could place on a map. The solution up to now had been to internationalise the problem, which means allow the UN to take the lead and UK provide support wherever it could. So the next morning, back in London, Friday the 5th of May, senior officials were taken by surprise when they met to discuss the overnight diplomatic telegram from New York, as well as increasingly worrying reports from the High Commissioner in Freetown. Overnight, the Permanent Joint Headquarters, or PGHQ, the UK's operational level headquarters, had done some rapid work on options for an evacuation of British and other entitled people from Sierra Leone. The options were based on a Special Forces Squadron, a parachute battalion, or a Royal Marines Commando in an amphibious operation. Now, Friday morning's meeting in the Cabinet Office kept all options open and decided to deploy an operational liaison and reconnaissance team, an OLRT, for the UK's standing deployable joint one-star headquarters into theatre immediately. Their job was to recommend what action, if any, the British government should take in the face of the deteriorating situation. So that evening, on Friday, within 24 hours of the UN Security Council meeting, Brigadier David Richards was in the air with the 12-strong team on his way to Freetown. Now, Richards had commanded the deployable Joint Force one-star headquarters at PGHQ for a little over 18 months. During that time, he had visited Sierra Leone 3 times to conduct preliminary planning in the event of a British intervention proving necessary. He knew President Kaba well and understood better than most the relative capabilities of rebels and government troops. The key point here is that although London was taken by surprise, the person who actually had to command the operation was not. Now, while the OLRT was getting ready to deploy, PGHQ was sending warning orders to all those who might have to go. The standby SAS squadron on exercise in Scotland readied for a direct deployment to theatre. 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, the Spearhead Battalion, 1 Para, rapidly convened a planning conference, including all its all-arms attachments, on Friday afternoon. Despite most of the battalion being on 5 days' notice to move, with only lead elements at 48 notice to move, the entire battalion group was ordered to be on parade at 8 o'clock the following morning, Saturday morning, packed and ready. And from there, they were bussed to the air mounting centre that morning. And all this was done on nothing more than a warning order. And this is a key point. Despite our doctrine, readiness is an attitude of mind. If you want to be ready, you can be. You don't need 5 days. For example, during CO1 Paris Friday afternoon planning conference, the junior officer commanding one of the attached arms groups, helicopter group that happens, pointed out he'd not received any orders from his chain of command, nor a reduction in his notice to move. The CO, Paul Gibson's response was immediate. "You're quite right, young man," he said. "You better go off right now and check with your chain of command." And so as the lieutenant disappeared through the door, Paul looked around at the rest of the group and said, "Anyone else here who doesn't want to go on operations?" Nobody put their hands up. Everyone wanted to go. As it happened, the hapless lieutenant never made it to Sierra Leone. The Marines were just as keen. The amphibious task group had just started their annual build-up exercise in the Mediterranean and had finished their whaler exercises. The ATG was centred on 42 Commando on HMS Ocean, plus the frigate HMS Chatham and the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries Sir Bedivere and Sir Tristram. On Friday, 42 Commando had just landed in southern France and started land training while the landing craft were exercising off the coast. When they got the warning order, it took 24 hours to get everyone back on board and ready for sea. So the amphibious task group deployed from Marseille early morning on Sunday, the 7th of May. Now, David Richards and the OLRT arrived in Freetown late in the morning on Saturday, the 6th of May, setting itself up in the British High Commission. Richards that afternoon met President Kaba, the UN Special Representative, and Major General Jetley, the Indian commander of UNAMSOR. He found, in his own words, the UN was in disarray and in the midst of preparing to evacuate. Now, he reassured General Jetley and UNAMSOR that the British would help defend Freetown's airport at Lungi. This commitment was clearly in advance of policy in London, but Richards thought it absolutely necessary to give confidence to a weak UN position. Richards was also told that the only thing that stood between the rebels and Freetown was a fragile UN position at Waterloo, and that the RUF had started to attack on a second axis around Port Loko on the road, you can't see the road here, but on the road to Lungi, which is where Freetown's main airport is. The team had also witnessed panic in Freetown as people feared a rerun of the horrors of previous year's attack on Freetown by the AFRC. So Richards reported back to PGHQ late that afternoon, Saturday afternoon. The situation was rapidly getting worse, that all three elements of the Joint Rapid Reaction Force should be deployed: the SAS Squadron, the Parachute Battalion Group, and the Amphibious Task Group. In particular, he requested that 1 Para should be deployed that night to a French base in Dakar, capital of Senegal, so they could deploy to Lungi Airport in Sierra Leone with much reduced response time. The formal authority to deploy was given on Sunday afternoon. By that time, The SAS were already in Dakar. The Paras were in the air on their way to Dakar, and the commanders were loading up stores in Gibraltar. Also on Sunday, the OLRT was redesignated as the Joint Task Force headquarters forward, and the rest of the HQ was ordered to join them. Other assets also started to move. 4 Chinook helicopters self-ferried, arriving in Freetown on Monday morning. The RAF also, at the time, was the longest, journey conducted by Chinooks. The RAF also established an air transport detachment in Dakar, ready to accept aircraft for a possible air evacuation. In the end, 4 RAF Tri-Styles and 5 chartered Antonov were used for the op. Furthermore, the carrier HMS Illustrious, carrying 13 Harrier jets and a number of Sea King helicopters, was diverted from the Eastern Med to West Africa to provide air support if necessary. On Sunday, the OLRT and the High Commission in Freetown heard sustained and heavy firing just down the road, about a kilometre from them. In the mid-afternoon, the High Commissioner judged the situation so bad that he formally requested Brigadier Richards to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation, or NEO, of all British and other entitled personnel from Sierra Leone. The subsequent British narrative of the events that Sunday afternoon describes how a large, peaceful demonstration outside Fode Sanko's villa in Freetown turned violent after Sanko's guards opened fire, unprovoked, on the unarmed demonstrators. Afterwards, Sanko, fearing retribution, fled the villa and went into hiding before being found a few days later. This narrative actually still believed in Britain. Actually, it's far from the truth. The violence was orchestrated by elements within the Sierra Leone government to decapitate the political wing of the RUF. Armed camouflages of the CDF and members of the AFRC attacked the UN Nigerian guard platoon guarding the villa, and then ransacked the house, killing most of Sanko's family and his bodyguard, while he narrowly escaped through a rear entrance with some of his UN guards. I don't think there's conclusive evidence that the Sierra Leone authorities did this deliberately to force Britain's hand. But it's a fact that the event which provoked British intervention was an attack by the government on the RUF, not the other way around. Regardless, the NEO swung into action. On Monday, the Para Battalion deployed to Lungi and sent a company forward into Freetown to secure a helicopter landing point to assist the High Commission process all the entitled personnel. Over the next few days, 428 people were evacuated, being ferried by Chinook from the assembly point to Lungi Airport and thence to Dakar by RAF Tri-Stars. All this was fairly straightforward stuff, well rehearsed, well within the capability of the company commanders and RAF movements personnel to handle. So David Richards and his command team focused their efforts on the more pressing problem posed by the RUF. Now, Richards received his first written orders on Wednesday the 10th of May, 4 days after the start of the operation. They were in the form of a Joint Commander's Mission Directive to the Joint Task Force Commander, issued by the PGHQ. And this was the intent. I'm sorry, there are a lot of words here, but it's worth reading. The UK remains determined to shore up the current UN operation without getting drawn in, and for no longer than absolutely necessary. Your priority is safe evacuation of the UK entitled personnel. Thereafter, I intend to support the UN operation principally by ensuring that the airport at Lungi can be used safely. Vital ground cannot be lost. Be it no doubt you have authority to engage in combat operations to ensure the airport is held for unanimous reinforcement. I do not anticipate UK providing more than a battalion-sized force to this operation. Footprint should be minimised, provision of support to theatre kept an absolute minimum, constrained by task, time and exposure. It is to be kept tight. Now, it's clear that London viewed Palliser as an economy of effort and wanted to minimise resources and risk. The orders specified the evacuation of entitled personnel and instructed Brigadier Richards to support UNAMSL principally by helping secure Lungi Airfield. Now, these orders make no mention of assistance to the government of Sierra Leone, nor the need to defeat the RUF. However, Richards was clear in his own mind that helping the Sierra Leone government was an implied task. UNAMSL could not succeed without government forces doing much of the heavy fighting against the RUF. So by assisting the Sierra Leoneans, he justified to himself he was also supporting UNAMSL. As a result, he had already decided upon and started to implement a campaign plan with two major lines of operation. First, to encourage UNAMSL to fight by adopting conventional defence rather than a peacekeeping posture that had made them so vulnerable to being kidnapped. Second was to turn the Sierra Leone government forces into an effective fighting organisation capable of defeating the RUF. He therefore turned a blind eye to what was not in his orders and did what he considered was in the British government's best interests. Now, the first line, British support to UNAMSL, that went well beyond the security of Lungi. The British also boosted the planning capability of the UNAMSL headquarters, wrote a campaign plan for UNAMSL, and embedded what the British called liaison officers down to all UN battalions, mostly persuade them to adopt a more warlike posture and be less vulnerable to attack. But fundamentally, the British were deeply frustrated that UNAMSL refused to take offensive action against the RUF, despite being empowered to do so by their mandate. On the other side, the UN were angered by the British refusal to put their forces under UNAMSL command, which would have significantly boosted the UN's confidence and capability. So relations between the two commanders, despite some great photo opportunities, remained difficult. The other line of operation was development of Sierra Leone's armed forces. Scaled down by Lomé, the army numbered only about 3,000 armed men. In the long term, this needed to be substantially increased, but in the meantime, we had to make do with what was available at the time. In addition to the army, this meant essentially a group of AFRC and CDF militias, most of whom had taken part in Sunday's attack on Fode Sanko's villa in Freetown. So the British set about organising a total force of about 6,000 fighters into 3 brigades or 3 battalions, each with embedded British officers and senior NCOs. Coordinated by a central operations centre built and run by the British, directed by a joint military committee made up of the various faction leaders. By the end of the first week in Palliser, government forces deployed forward to Waterloo, supported by their one Mi-24 attack helicopter, flown by South African contract pilots with a Fijian door gunner, ex-SAS. They started to push RUF forces back about 10 kilometres further away from Freetown. So this was an important week, this first week. It started with one Paris arrival and ended with the amphibious task group arriving in theatre. The NEO had been conducted without serious hitches. UNAMSL had been stabilised and further UN withdrawal halted. Most importantly, local government forces had been organised were now taking the offensive against the RUF. Now the UK's Chief of Defence Staff, General Sir Charles Guthrie, visited the theatre at the end of the week. It was an important visit. Guthrie was trusted by Tony Blair, and it was Brigadier Richard's opportunity to influence the government to accept his approach, which was still well ahead of London in regard to developing and coordinating the operations of the Sierra Leoneans against the RUF. Fortunately, Guthrie was in complete agreement with what Richards had done. As a result, the MOD endorsed the need for a longer-term training mission to expand and professionalise the Sierra Leone army, which was to become Operation Basilica. Now, during Palliser, there was one major contact between British forces and the RUF. It was to the east of Lungi Airport and took place one early morning in the second week of the op. Now, Sierra 1 Para, tasked to defend the Lungi Airport, had deployed two companies for the mission, one providing close protection to the airport and the other operating further out to provide depth to the defence. Now, the forward position was at Lungi Log and was manned by the Parachute Regiment's Pathfinder Platoon. This is a small hamlet about 25 k's to the east of the airport, where two roads join towards the airport. And although Paul Gibson, the CO, justified the forward deployment as essential to the defence of the airport, actually the position was designed as a come-on, encouraging the RUF to attack it. It deliberately looked weak and unsupported, but was actually well protected with support weapons, including a section of 81mm mortars. About 4:45 on the 17th of May, the Pathfinder platoon identified some 40 RUF moving along the road towards them. As they quietly stood to, the rebels deployed into a baseline along a low bank from where they engaged in the British position. The firefight lasted about 10 minutes. The 81s fired Illume, but the ROEs forbade them from firing HE. The RUF later reported about 14 killed and a number wounded, and many weapons left behind. The British view, and I think this probably is right, that this had a deep psychological effect. It was just a brief engagement, but nevertheless was really important in deterring the RUF, enhancing British status, also in the eyes of the UN and the Sierra Leoneans. By the time the Paras had been in theatre for a couple of weeks, they were beginning to suffer logistically. Most, in fact I think pretty all, had only deployed with the clothes they stood up in. And aircraft space from England had prioritised weapons and ammunition rather than personal kit. And once HMS Ocean had arrived, of course the Royal Navy organised a system of showers and laundry for the Para Battalion Group on a rotational basis, but nevertheless the Paras were at the end of their, or nearing the end of their logistic tether. Worryingly, some were beginning to display symptoms of malaria. Since they deployed so quickly, there hadn't been enough time, sufficient time for prophylaxis. So as the situation began to stabilise, it was time to replace one Para with 4-2 Commando, which took place on 24th, 25th of May, with the Paras returning home the same day. Now, despite continuing RUF attacks, the situation continued to stabilise. Most UNAMSL soldiers that had been taken hostage were released in Liberia at the end of May, which greatly improved both UN numbers and morale. The government forces, Sierra Leone government forces, also holding their ground. 27th of May, the RAF mounted a major attack on a government position near Berry Junction, killing 21 and wounding a further 21, but the defence held despite the high level of casualties. In the British view, Palliser had been a success and had sufficiently stabilised the situation that on the 15th of June, after 6 weeks, the operation ended and the Joint Task Force headquarters withdrew and Operation Basilica started. Now, Basilica's commander was Brigadier Gordon Hughes of the Royal Signals. His main focus was a short-term training team based on an infantry battalion to select and train a further 3,000 men of the Sierra Leone Army. But it also included a team to completely rebuild from scratch the Sierra Leone Ministry of Defence and structure of its armed forces. All of this work was essential, of course, if Sierra Leone was ever going to secure itself. But it wasn't enough. Without the leadership and coordinating machinery of the Joint Task Force headquarters, the campaign against the RUF lost momentum. In particular, the alliance between the pro-government militias, always fragile, broke down, and the AFRC, restyling themselves the West Side Boys, set up a fiefdom in the Okra Hills on the edge of the Freetown Peninsula. It was this bunch that, on the 25th of August, high on drugs, crazed by power, took hostage Major Alan Marshall and 11 members of the Royal Irish Regiment on a routine visit. Over the next 2 weeks, the hostages were subject to extreme violence by the increasingly erratic West Side boys. Despite continuing negotiations conducted by Simon Fordham, the CEO of the Royal Irish, and assisted by expert negotiators from the Metropolitan Police, the British prepared for a rescue operation. An SAS squadron and a parachute company were moved to Dakar to prepare for a possible rescue. 2 covert OPs were inserted by night by boat to the outskirts of the rebel camp to monitor the mood within the camp. The decision to launch the rescue was made on the 9th of September by the government in London. The OPs had reported increasing volatility amongst the captors and that the lives of the hostages were in grievous danger. So the op was launched the following morning, D Squadron abseiling from helicopters directly into the centre of the rebel camp where the hostages were held. And A Company, one para, landing to the south of the river to clear a second rebel camp that could support the first to the north. Not a stealthy and clinical hostage rescue like some SF ops. More or less conventional military attack with emphasis on surprise, overwhelming firepower and rapid action. The hostages were released for the loss of 1 SAS fatality shot early in the raid. On the other side of the river, south of the river, A Company captured their objectives despite the company command team all being taken out by a mortar bomb, wounded. Under the company's second command, A Company continued their assault with grenades, clearing each house with grenades and small arms. And the para suffered 13 injuries during that assault. West Side casualties, officially stated as 25 dead, but likely to be much higher. After the op was over, analysis was conducted to assess the circumstances in which the Royal Irish were taken hostage. Conducted by a brigadier from Land Command, the analysis concluded Major Alan Marshall made an error of professional judgment. Major Marshall made a grave mistake. Another senior officer, it wasn't me, had a different view, saying it's easy for officers safe back in Land Command to second guess what Marshall should or should not have done and talk of making a grave mistake in exercising his initiative. Any number of patrols could conceivably have ended up in similar circumstances. All of these ops rely on the use of initiative. We rely on men such as Marshall to stick their necks out in ops all over the world. We must therefore prepare for things not always to go to plan. That's why we have contingencies, and they must have the confidence that we will back them up, come what may. Now, despite the report's apparent censure of his decision, Alan Marshall continues to serve a successful career in the British Army. But the post-incident analysis went further. The British commander in Sierra Leone, Gordon Hughes, was publicly admonished for permitting a situation where the British troops could be taken hostage. Although, of course, the ultimate responsibility did lie with him, he didn't have the resources to have prevented it. His was a training setup, not an operational headquarters, and there wasn't much he could have done differently with the organisation he had. So despite the internal blame game, however, the success of Barras was quickly exploited. At a press conference immediately afterwards, Secretary of State Jeff Hood stated, "We hope the West Side Group and other rebel units, the RUF in other words, will now realise the futility of continuing unlawful operation, and instead accept the rule of law." Ever since then, British commentators tend to describe Barras as the turning point in the Sierra Leone War as a whole, due to the powerful messages sent to the RUF about the UK's resolve and capability. Actually, there's little evidence for this. There was no change in the RUF's behaviour, nor were they any more persuaded to implement the Lomé Peace Accord. Where Barras did make a difference was it eliminated the West Side Boys as an organisation and removed them as a potential spoiler to the peace process. So at this stage, there was still nothing to force the RUF to accept the terms of Lomé. they remained in control over half the country and appeared to be strengthening their hold over the diamond-producing areas. Charles Taylor continued to provide weaponry and logistic support in exchange for diamonds. The RUF showed no sign of wanting to return to good negotiations, and indeed were expanding their operations into neighbouring Guinea. So although the UK's development of the Sierra Leone army was bearing fruit, it was all too slow, and there was a lack of a single coordinating headquarters that could simultaneously defeat the RUF while building Sierra Leone forces over the long term. In the view of Charles Guthrie at the CDS, what was needed was a powerful headquarters in Sierra Leone that could fill both functions at the same time. In the later words of the, by now Lord, no longer General, or Brigadier Richards, we replaced operational headquarters with a bunch of trainers. We attempted transition too early. After we departed, the RUF gained confidence. By September 2002, again deteriorating, we took a risk and failed. And this was the birth of Operation Silkman. Now, Silkman was the fourth operation of the British engagement and the most decisive strategically. It was the one that finally forced the RUF to engage with the peace process and surrender themselves to DDR. The decision was taken to deploy a joined-up operational level headquarters into theatre as soon as possible. And that headquarters should, unlike Palliser, be a long-term one. So HQ 1st Mechanised Brigade, an ordinary army brigade, under the command of Brigadier John Riley, was warned for a 6-month tour, after which they were to be replaced by a semi-permanent joint one-star HQ in Freetown, with trickle-posted commanders and staff. But one brigade was at 30 days' notice to move, and unlike one para back in May, it was decided to honour this notice to move time and not deploy them until mid-November. In the meantime, the JFHQ under David Richards was sent back to Freetown to fill the gap until one brigade arrived. So the JFHQ arrived back in Freetown on the 12th of November, 4 months after they departed from Palliser. The British viewpoint is that their arrival had an immediate impact. As Lord Richards commented afterwards, Silkman was all psychological. He said his attempt was to convince the RUF of the inevitability of their defeat. They designed an information operation that exploited these. The amphibious task group was tasked to come back, and generally a coordination really of what was already happening. Now, according to the British narrative, it's largely a result of the success of this information operation that encouraged the RUF to engage in ceasefire and more ceasefire discussions to be held in Abuja in Nigeria. Now, before assessing the truth of that assertion, let's look at the Royal Marines' second deployment. UNAMSO had been, or was planning on conducting a major rotation of troops and change of command from November 2000. And the potential hiatus caused by this changeover sufficiently worried the Sierra Leone government and the British government. They agreed to deploy the UK Amphibious Task Group back to Sierra Leone to conduct a demonstration. They were again on exercise in the Mediterranean. This time, redeployment was rather less rushed, and HMS Ocean arrived off at Sierra Leone the evening of Sunday, the 12th of November. Richards told local radio that Britain's intent in deploying the maritime force was to remind the rebels that Britain meant business here. I think the imminent arrival of the task group probably was a factor in them coming to the peace table a little earlier than we anticipated. So on Monday, the ATG started the amphibious demonstration in Freetown. The local media reported that convoys of British military vehicles rumbled through the streets. For the rest of the week, 4-2 Commando conducted jungle training outside Freetown, including an impressive live fire display for which there were large invited audience. Now, so let's now return to the ceasefire agreement signed in Abuja, Nigeria, on the 10th of November. This is the fourth such international attempt to end the war. Its main terms were these. As we've seen, the British thought it was their return to Sierra Leone that was the key to persuading the RUF to return to the negotiating table and agree these. Others thought that the RUF was genuinely interested in returning to the Lomé Accord. Neither was true. The RUF agreed to the ceasefire in order to relieve military pressure on its units as they mounted a major new offensive campaign in neighbouring Guinea, at the request of, paid for and supported by, Charles Taylor. He wanted to apply military pressure against Guinea, accusing it of destabilising his own regime in Liberia. With a ceasefire in place and without fear of attack, the RUF could use their territory and northern and eastern Sierra Leone as a safe base from which to mount their attacks into Guinea. That's why they signed the Abuja Agreement. It had nothing to do with the arrival of the British. Unfortunately, not only were we mistaken by the causes of the Abuja ceasefire, we also deluded ourselves that it was the effective end of the war. David Richards returned back to PGHQ after handing over to 1 Mech Brigade, saying the war had been won, and all John Riley had to do was to take forward the peace process and implement longer-term training and restructuring plans. That's a quote. Alas, it was not to be so easy. Like every other previous attempt at peace in Sierra Leone, unless the agreement was backed by credible threat of force, the RUF just ignored it while using the time to gain to rearm. After Abuja, the RUF refused to turn up to meetings with UNAMSL to discuss implementation. UNAMSL was not granted freedom of movement. The only kit returned during the ceasefire was 11 derelict UN armoured vehicles, being stripped of all weapons and equipment. No weapons or ammunition was surrendered, and no RUF fighters underwent DDR. Nevertheless, as we see, the ceasefire held, and Sierra Leone enjoyed a largely peaceful Christmas for the first time since 1990. But not so, of course, in Guinea. So in late 2000, early 2001, RUF conducted a series of major raids in the border area of Guinea, often abducting or recruiting Guineans to create the illusion the attacks were conducted by Guinean dissidents rather than Sierra Leoneans. The attacks are estimated to have caused over 1,000 deaths and displaced more than 100,000 people. But the Guinean government was ruthless in its response. In January 2001, it started a campaign of cross-border raids into Sierra Leone to destroy RUF bases, using multiple launch rocket systems and attack helicopters to attack RUF-occupied towns, causing very heavy casualties, not just among the RUF, but among civilians. There's no question that the RUF lost that campaign in Guinea. They suffered very heavily and lost many of their most experienced commanders were killed in about a 6-week period. Now, when Brigadier Riley assumed command of Silkman on the 25th of November, and HQ1 Mech Brigade became the JTF headquarters, there was a general belief in London the war had been won. As we now know, that belief was wrong. The RUF had no intention of disarming and were determined to hold on to their weapons and control their territory, including the diamond areas. They would need to be forced to surrender to DDR, and it was up to the new JTF HQ to force them to do it. But the false belief that the war had been won was to bedevil relationships between the PGHQ and the operational headquarters of the theatre over the coming months. For a long time, PGHQ thought that Sierra Leone was involved in post-conflict activities, while the reality was that the war hadn't ended, and that the JTF headquarters had to take the lead in coercing the RUF into the peace process. Now, the directive issued by PGHQ quoted the UK government's strategic end state. Seems to be very similar to many government strategic end states. Notice there's no specific mention of the RUF. But Riley was convinced that the key to achieving this strategic end state was to win the war. This could be done through the physical destruction of the RUF or through coercing them to accept the DDR process offered by the UN. carrot and stick approach. Both options, at least partly dependent on the two enabling objectives of first, producing effective Sierra Leone armed forces for the immediate fight, while second, developing the longer-term whole machinery of defence. Now, it was clear that success was largely dependent on isolating the RUF from Taylor in Liberia and limiting their profit from diamonds. Much of the success of the campaign, therefore, lay outside Sierra Leone and within the remit of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So, for example, the UK pushed hard from the UN to break the link between illicit rough diamonds and armed conflict, including drafting the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on 1 December 2000 that led to the establishment of the Kimberley process in 2003. Now, the One Brigade produced a campaign plan, 5 phases, including the capture of what Riley had concluded was the RUF's operational level centre of gravity, the diamond fields in eastern Sierra Leone. It was written by John, but it was a plan for the Sierra Leoneans, and to a lesser extent, UNAMSL, to implement with British help. Accordingly, the physical document was co-signed by both Brigadier Riley and the Chief of the Sierra Leone Army. By December 2000, January 2001, the training regime started during Palliser was beginning to bear fruit. The Sierra Leone Army now had 4 effective brigades, with British advisors, officers and senior NCOs embedded down to battalion level. Against a much weakened RUF, still focused on Guinea, the Sierra Leone Army occupied areas which had not seen effective government for years. This included, on Christmas Day, moving the entire 3rd Brigade in a single lift, 300 road lift, 300 kilometres to the main inland town of Kenema, which hadn't seen government forces for years. This reportedly electrified both the army and the population, creating a sense of confidence that at last the war was coming to an end. Buoyed by increasing capability of the Sierra Leone Army, with a sense of purpose and a sound campaign plan, UNAMSL was now at last at its full authorised strength of 17,500, and a fatally weakened RUF. President Kaba invited the RUF leadership back to Abuja, in his words, to review the implementation of the November 2000 ceasefire. These talks became known as Abuja 2. The rebels realised their military campaign had been defeated, the government forces were the ascendancy and would continue to be so, and the political deal on offer was as good as it was ever going to be. So on the 5th attempt at a political settlement, the RUF caved in. And so it happened. The DDR programme was relaunched on the 18th of May 2001, a year after its suspension, with the widespread capture of UN peacekeepers a year earlier. Over the next 8 months, 47,000 combatants were disarmed, half RUF, half Civil Defence Force. By the end of February 2002, the Sierra Leone armed forces were fully deployed around the country's borders, and the bulk of the country was, for the first time in 11 years, under government control. The war was over. This wasn't the end of the British involvement. Importantly, the UK had offered Sierra Leone a 10-year security guarantee, which did much to bring confidence politically to political investors. This guarantee was partly managed by the establishment of a British-run international military assistance and training team, of which there were a few Australian members, or IMET, whose long-term establishment was 114 military personnel, which remained until 2013. Finally, I think I just want to mention a little bit extra about the UN. UN and British were frustrated with each other throughout much of the intervention. They couldn't understand why the UK, as the ex-colonial power, would not contribute its forces to boost UNAMSL. The British, for our part, were exasperated that they wouldn't take a more aggressive posture towards the RUF rather than being neutral. But both sides misunderstood the different roles that were required. There was a role for the impartiality of UNAMSL to manage the DDR process once the RUF had been defeated. But the RUF were not going to enter the DDR process until they had been defeated. And this is the job of the Sierra Leone Army, with British support. Both roles are required, though neither side understood that at the time, hence the mutual but unnecessary frustration between British and the UN. David Richards thinks there's a huge number of lessons and insights to be drawn from Sierra Leone, but I just want to finish with 4. Rapid intervention can stabilize the situation before it deteriorates, but by itself, it's unlikely to be strategically decisive. Only long-term commitment is likely to have strategic impact. We need to balance in an operation such as this between the long-term rebuilding of indigenous forces and the shorter-term requirement to stabilize and defeat the enemy. There are likely to be 2 distinct roles for military forces, as we said, one a combat role, one a neutral. And finally, don't be beguiled that your own narrative is the objective truth. It's extremely tempting, but can be highly dangerous. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.